When it comes to Capcom and their IPs, they cover a multitude of genres. I mean, they have Mega Man, a platformer. For horror, they have Resident Evil, Monster Hunter, that's an action JRPG, and much more. However, there's one IP that they own that I would say that isn't as popular as the others, and of course, that being the Ace Attorney series.
Objection!
The Ace Attorney series is kind of like the war veteran compared to the other franchises. Sure, it will be respected among its community, but it also would get disrespected and mistreated. Basically, the series sometimes gets the short end of the stick, especially when it comes to the West. But that's of course common with small IPs that come from Japan. But we're not here to talk about how Ace Attorney gets slapped around by Capcom's dick. No, we're here to appreciate the series, especially since they finally released both the great Ace Attorney games to the West. Yes, I know this video is long overdue, but let's not worry about that. Now, I'm sure fans of the series already know what Ace Attorney is and the history of the series, especially the build-up and creation of the great Ace Attorney. Though, I feel like I'd be doing a disservice to those who don't know much about the series, so in this first segment I'll briefly go on about the history of the series. So strap in and grab your Edgeworth body pillows and get those pointer fingers ready, as we briefly go back to the past. Welcome to the year 2000, where YouTube wasn't even created and the PS2 was released in Japan, and where the idea of Ace Attorney is about to be born. Created by Shu Takumi, he was given 6 months to create any game that he wanted, and with that freedom, he wanted to make a game where he would go around investigating and call out contradictions, which eventually led to him creating Ace Attorney, a visual novel where you play as a rookie lawyer who does, well, lawyer stuff. Now, at first you might think that playing as a lawyer doesn't sound as fun, except if you were playing as Saul Goodman.
What now?
Can you tell the court what that was?
A battery.
Chairman.
And that's what I believed at first, but as you play through the first chapter and point out all the contradictions of the witnesses and finally expose them of its lies, man does it feel good. Takumi knew what he needed to add. I mean, having you point out contradictions being a main element of the game, without it, the game wouldn't have stood out as much. The game soon came out in 2001 in Japan on GBA, where it garnered massive success, so much so that the second game went into development right after. The series would eventually get localized, with the first game coming out in 2005 on Nintendo DS, with the same critical success. Overall, this game was a massive hit with everyone, and again, it was due to that nice feeling of pointing out contradictions, as well as having a great story. But after the trilogy ended, Takumi didn't know where else he could have led the series since Phoenix Art ended, but Capcom desperately wanted more games. However, Takumi wasn't really sure how to continue the series, so he decided to give the ropes to someone else to create the fourth game in the main series, that becoming Apollo Justice.
Objection!
Takumi was sent in the back mainly, overlooking the development of the series, and we wouldn't see another game directed by him until the creator of another well-known visual novel, Professor Layton, brought up the idea to Takumi to make a crossover between their games. This eventually led to the creation of Professor Layton vs. Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney, which combined both gameplay styles and resulted in a very good game. Also, I'd like to mention that this was the game that introduced me to Ace Attorney and led me to eventually loving the series. But after the release of Professor Layton vs. Phoenix Wright in 2012, Takumi was asked to make another Ace Attorney game. But he didn't want to make the same game, so he decided to come up with a different concept that's similar to the crossover. A game that's in the title and the main subject of the video.
Objection!
Takumi decided to go back into the past and focus more on the aspect of civil trials, and bring back an idea that he had all the way back when Ace Attorney was still in its concept phase. That being of having a detective that would have outlandish deductions, and you, the player, would have to correct them. This led to him deciding to want to have Sherlock Holmes in the game and being the key figure in it, with one of the gameplay segments being the dance of deductions, whereas previously mentioned, you'll be correcting his deductions, though this decision will become a problem in time, however. This made him decide to go all the way back to the Meiji era, but have the gameplay mainly take place in London. With having the setting in mind, all that was left to make was the story, which took them a while, with it being eventually finalized in April 2015. With everything finally being finished, all they had to do was ship the game out in July on Nintendo 3DS. Available only in Japan. And how was the reception for this game? Well... yeah, the first game wasn't received that well. I mean, this is Japan we're talking about, and they rarely give out low scores, but albeit, let's get into why it was poorly received. The main criticism is that the game felt incomplete, which, I mean, after playing it kind of did, especially since there was already plans of it having a sequel. I won't really be going into the specifics, just so I don't spoil anything, but due to the game's story being incomplete and having to further wait for the second game, the game just didn't do well. Due to this, it's likely why the duology were never released in the West. Well, partially the reason. Because the game was set in the Meiji era, and the character being confirmed being Japanese, translating these games proved to be difficult. How do you translate a game that has jokes that can only be understood in Japanese, and then have them nonchalantly talk about certain things within your culture without going over the Westerner's head? And would you decide to keep the characters' accents and dialects, or change them to make them more understandable to the larger audience? These were things that they had to keep in mind if they were to localize the duology. Then there's also the fact that they have freaking Sherlock Holmes in the game, who is a copyrighted character. All of these painstaking decisions to keep in mind, and the money that would have been needed to be spent to release the game that wasn't really well received in Japan, just didn't seem like a good idea. So, as to avoid all of that, the final decision would be to not take the risk and not localize it. Until now. That's right, it only took 4 years and a next, semi-next-gen console to localize it to the West. With both games finally being out of Japan and being packaged as one, making it a complete game makes this the definitive edition. Especially with all the small bonuses that's included. Now everyone can experience this gem of a game, and with all the history being laid out, I think it's finally time to get it into the heart of the game and show their greatness. Get it? Because it's called The Great Ace Attorney, and they're great games? Yeah? No? Okay, I think I'll just shut up and just move on. To start things off, I thought I'd begin by talking about the game's plot. So, we play as a young Japanese student named Ryunosuke Naruhodo, who is the ancestor of our beloved Phoenix Wright, where we get accused of murdering a British man who was an honorary visitor. So with the help of her best friend, Kazuma Asogi, a studying lawyer, he defends us in court. But plans change, for if Kazuma were to lose in the court trial, then he will lose his opportunity to go to Britain to continue studying law. So, Ryunosuke takes the courage and defends himself in court, even though he has no experience as a lawyer. Of course, he manages to defend himself and prove his innocence, which, if this was a real life, this would never happen. Ever. So if you ever find yourself in this sort of a situation, get a lawyer. But after the trial, Kazuma decides to take Ryunosuke with him to London, so he sneaks him on and tragically he meets his end on board. Bit of a spoiler, I know, but it happens in the second chapter, so I think it's fine. Anyways, with the help of both Kazuma's assistant, Susato, and the famous detective, Sherlock Holmes, yes, that's what they decided to name him to avoid copyright, they work together to solve the mystery of Kazuma's murder. Then once that's solved, Ryunosuke decides to take up the mantle and continue to study abroad, and studies to become a lawyer to honor Kazuma's wish of changing the legal system of Japan. So it's a pretty straightforward premise with there being twists and turns that happen along the way. Now, I would go more in depth as to what happens in the story, however, I wouldn't want to spoil the game any further, since I would like it if you lovely viewers took the time to play this wonderful game for yourself. Now, what I will do, however, is go into detail as to why I love this game, at least compared to the other games in the series. So, without further ado, let's actually get into that. For starters, I like to compliment the change of settings from the main series. In them, the setting is kind of in a strange place because in Japan, the main Ace Attorney games take place in modern Japan, while in the localized version, the games take place in modern time, except the country they live in is a mix of both Japan and America, which leads to weird circumstances, like the one memeable case where in the Japanese version, Maya likes ramen, but in the Western release, she likes hamburgers. But for the Great Ace Attorney, as I've mentioned, it takes place in both Japan and London, so it's cool to see that the game takes place in a realistic setting this time, especially during a time where science wasn't as advanced as it is now, which makes trying to solve these cases even more interesting as you wonder how they'll solve it with the limitations that they have. Although there are cases where technology that wasn't invented at the time do make appearances because of Sherlock Holmes being a inventor, but I'm still able to overlook those cases and appreciate the way the story is able to put these pieces together and solve the mystery. Since I brought up the story, let me talk about it for a bit. Because the duology aren't associated with the main series, aside from the fact that Naruhodo is Phoenix's ancestor, it allows it to form its own identity. It makes it able to establish a cohesive narrative. It doesn't have to handcuff itself with the things that have been established by the previous games. To further elaborate, one of the problems that the main series has is how the newer games are written. Because there are currently 6 games in the series, it's hard for the writers to bring up topics that have happened in previous games to try to prevent new players from getting spoiled. Because of this, beloved characters from previous games aren't mentioned in the slightest, like Detective Gumshoe. And it was a miracle that they decided to bring back Maya for Spirit of Justice. And who knows if she'll even be in the 7th installment. I doubt it. They could have prevented this if they kept 4 through 6 mainly focused on Apollo, and not have Phoenix as part of the central characters for marketing purposes. But as fans know, this only happened due to the low sales of Apollo Justice, because it didn't have Phoenix as the main character. I could go more into this, but that's a whole other thing, and people have already talked about that, and have given a better explanation than I could have. But tangent aside, I do like how both Great Ace Attorney games create one single narrative that leaves no room for or reason for there to be a third game or so. Then there's the cast. When you play as Ryunosuke, you could definitely feel Phoenix's energy from him, and it's fun to see him being thrown into a completely different culture that he's used to, even if he does encounter some of the racism from the people of London. For Susato, her being a very informative assistant while giving similar vibes to Maya just makes her a lovable character to have by your side. Then there's Ryunosuke's best friend, Kazuma. He kind of embodies the Japanese spirit at the time, being a very honorable person as well as being very astute. Though we don't see him for long, he does do a good job at giving Ryunosuke the courage to becoming a lawyer. Then there's the famous literary duo, Sherlock Holmes and Iris Wilson. At first you believe that Takumi would represent them as closely to their literary counterparts, however this isn't the case. Instead, he decided to make Sholmes act like a goofy guy who happens to be able to solve complex cases, and as for Watson, instead of him being an old gentleman sort of guy, they instead decided to make him into a 10-year-old girl who's very intelligent and also writes books based on Sholmes' case, which resemble closely to the actual books of Sherlock Holmes. I just like the chemistry of these characters, and I just especially like Sholmes, who just brightens the mood whenever he shows up on screen. As for the detective, we have Tobias Gregson, who just embodies England as a whole, as a grumpy man who eats fish and chips everywhere he goes. And I guess he also says bottle of water or something like that, I don't know. Although he is a grumpy person and does everything he could to not help you, it's still kind of hard to not like him. Then finally, we have the prosecutor, Barak von Zeeks. He sort of gives off similar vibes as Manfred von Karma, as a person who won't stand for any BS, especially from Ryunosuke, being a foreign student. He also just has this menacing aura that really lives up to his name as the Reaper of the Bailey. As for the side characters like the witnesses, defendants, suspects, and jury, there are of course a colorful bunch of them. However, a lot of them are reused, sometimes more than twice, and it's kind of upsetting that we don't see a bit more. Though, for it being self-contained at 2 games, and it probably being a lot of work to make a bunch of side characters that would have been used once, gives the game some leeway. Overall, I again love the cast in this game. They just fit the realistic setting for this game. Well, sorta realisticness. Also, you might have heard me mention jury a few seconds back there. And, well, that's right. For this game, Takumi decided to add segments where you have to convince the jury to change their stances from a guilty to a non-guilty, by pitting each juror's reasons with one another. I like this feature, as it changes the flow of the game from the typical calling out a witness's contradiction in their testimony. Then there's also the simple addition that was introduced from Professor Layton vs. Phoenix Wright's mock trial. Though it's not named the same thing, but simply there'll be more than one witnesses on stand, and there'll be cases where one of the multiple witnesses will have a thought bubble when you're pressing a witness. Both of these additions are a great change of pace from the normal Ace Attorney game in my opinion, and I would love for them to be implemented in future installments in the main series instead of having to rely on gimmicks like in Spirit of Justice. Now, I know I mentioned earlier that I won't be talking about spoilers, but there's just a bit more that I really want to talk about the story. So with all of that mentioned, I'm going to talk a bit further about what I liked in the story. So before I move on, I like to give a spoiler warning up ahead. I'm not going to go in-depth about the game's ending, but I'll be mentioning certain plot points, so if you want to avoid any mentions of spoilers, then skip to the timestamp on screen. However, if you beaten the game or don't care, then let us proceed. I feel like most can agree that most murder mystery visual novels usually have the problem of their second to however long the second to last chapter are not written the best compared to the first and last chapter. I mean, I'm sure Ace Attorney fans can point to a certain case from Justice for All. Anyways, for the Great Ace Attorney, I feel like it doesn't suffer a whole lot from this issue. Each case flows smoothly with each other, and they all have some purpose for the main story. Like the third case from the first game. Well, technically it would be considered the second, since the second chapter didn't have a trial. But ramblings aside, in that case, Ryunosuke gets roped into his first British court trial, and is made to defend McGillis. He's made to look innocent at first, but as we slowly progress through the trial, we find out that he actually committed the crime. But because the evidence was fabricated during the trial, he gets a non-guilty verdict. Not only does this trial show the legal system is flawed in some way, but it also introduces us to the mystery of the Reaper of the Bailey, as after the trial, McGillis dies. Then again, in the third case, in the second game, through the investigation of the case, we find out that the coroner had a huge part in the professor's case, where she was the one who did the autopsy of the professor. Then further into the trial, we find out that she forged the professor's autopsy, leaving us wondering what actually occurred that night of the professor's awakening. Although these two examples don't relate with one another, they reveal subtle clues or bring questions that come together to build this bigger mystery throughout the game. So overall, not every case feels like it's a waste of time or that much of a bother to get through. Although the video wasn't that cohesive, there's a lot about the Great Ace Attorney that I love, as I just mentioned, and because so, I want the future of the Ace Attorney games to be as great as it. The modern Ace Attorney games are fine as is, however, there's a bit that could be added to make them just as great as the Great Ace Attorney. If the writers for the current games look at the Great Ace Attorney and take a few notes from them, then I think Ace Attorney can be just as great. So to end things off, I just want to say once again that I love the duology. Of course, the original trilogy does have a place in my heart, however, as for the modern series, the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles is my favorite. And if you're a fan of Ace Attorney, or someone who's into murder mystery visual novels, then I highly encourage to give these games a try. And I'm sure you'll also love these games, and also see the greatness of them.
Yes!